Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. We continue the conversation on the middle class that began on Eldridge and Company. Joining Ronnie and me again are John Mollenkopf, the director of the Center for Urban Research at the CUNY Graduate Center, and Andrea Batista Schlesinger, the executive director of the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy, who's been named in Crain's, New York as one of the New York City influentials under 40. I'm honored to have you both. John and Andrea, we've got rising income inequality. We've got a dumbbell effect in our income distribution, and we've got changing demography in New York City. How does this all work together in terms of the rise, the movement of the middle class?
Well, one thing that's really important to look at is which kind of people are in these different income brackets over time.
Mm-hmm.
And just as the overall income distribution is changing, the people who are in the different brackets are changing as well. So I've sorted it out in terms of people who, both by race and by the nativity of the household head, whether they're immigrants or native-born people. And all of the people living in native-born households, whether they're black, white, Latino, well, the Asian native-born is growing slightly, but it's a very small group. But the other native-born groups are all diminishing over time in New York City. Neighborhoods that used to be very, very Italian out in the south part of Brooklyn are now becoming
much more
Russian.
Right.
That population is declining. People know that, I think. I think they're less aware of the fact that the African American population and the Puerto Rican populations of New York City are also declining. As people age, they retire, they move out to the suburbs, their kids move off to other cities. Those groups are declining. And the growth is all in the different immigrant groups. And if you map the changing size of the groups against where they are in the changing income distribution, the native whites that are remaining in New York City are very strongly shifting towards the upper end of the income distribution. The blacks, people living in native black households, they're more clumped down towards the lower income to begin with, but they're also making something of a shift upward, but meanwhile diminishing in terms of overall presence. Same is true to a lesser extent of the Puerto Rican households. So all of the native-born groups, even though they're declining, are experiencing a bit of a shift upward in their distributional profile over time. Now, if you look at the growing immigrant groups, immigrant whites are less well off than native-born white households. We're talking, the former Soviet families in Brighton Beach, for example. Many of the first generation, even though they came in with a lot of education, they didn't get commensurate jobs.
Right, they were
on
cabs,
welfare, they
right.
were on cabs and so forth. The white immigrants are shifting pretty strongly upward over time, like the native whites, and growing. The immigrant blacks are also shifting upward over time and growing. The immigrant Asian households are perhaps most shifting upwards of any of the income groups.
And
quite
Hispanics?
Extraordinary. And the Hispanics are the one counter trend to that. There's a big growth at the bottom of low income Hispanic people in Hispanic immigrant households. And I think part of that is just the rise of immigration from places like Mexico and to some extent the Dominican Republic, where there probably is a pretty high share of undocumented people. If you go along 64th Street out in Brooklyn,
Go ahead.
and you see like a 20 block long day labor shape up there. Now these people are getting jobs for 10, 12, sometimes more dollars per hour, but it's very intermittent work. There are no benefits. There's a lot of abuse by employers of the day labor, I think, in terms of whether they actually pay people. So those people are coming from parts of Puebla, Mexico, say, where they could earn $2 a day, and they can obviously earn much more here. But from our perspective, in terms of our labor market, these are among the worst jobs and lowest paid jobs.
And many of them are transient in the fact that they go back and forth a lot. Their families are basically
they're less transient than they used to be. As border enforcement becomes tougher and tougher, people are more likely to stay and less likely to
Are they moving families in, though, as
They
well?
are. I think they are moving families in.
Let's do, before I want to turn to Andrea and DMI's work with immigration policy, where are these folks living? What are the neighborhoods that are experiencing middle-class expansion? Because we often hear about those that we're losing to gentrification.
Right. Well, it depends on the group. But think Afro-Caribbeans, for example. Canarsie, about which we read 20 or 30 years ago about fights against school integration and keep blacks out and so forth. Canarsie is now basically a West Indian neighborhood. There's a whole new Chinatown in Sunset Park and throughout, Avenue U and so forth. And there are new Chinatowns and very healthy middle class communities in Queens. I mean, the Asian influence on the city is maybe especially strong in Queens, but there are different patterns depending on the group. There are South Asians in certain places. Indo-Guyanese, we were talking about in Richmond Hill, for example.
Right. So when you look at the boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn and Queens seem to be the home of the immigrants and the emerging, therefore, middle class. When you look at your data on Staten Island, it's not really there.
Well,
the income disparities are the broadest, and it's the most white, and it's the least middle class.
It's
and
the most.
Manhattan.
It's the most white, but it too is becoming less white, and there are more and more immigrants moving to Staten Island.
And are
for
they
the same
developing
reasons,
different kinds of?
Well, I haven't taken a real close look at it, but I just looking at the overall numbers, there are middle class Asian households moving to Staten Island, just as Italian American families from Brooklyn did a generation ago
when they opened the bridge, and then subsequently.
Who's living in the Bronx?
The Bronx is the poorest borough in New York City, despite middle class or upper middle class enclaves like Riverdale and Fieldston.
And Parkway area.
I'd say the biggest growth is in the Dominican population. Washington Heights has become so crowded, and if that's the zone of first residence, then going across the river into the Bronx is kind of like a step up from.
Which
Washington
follows the
Heights.
previous patterns of moving out. Andrea, DMI has, for a long time, it's the 2007 edition, Principles for an Immigration Policy to Strengthen and Expand the Middle Class. Talk about the policy implications of this immigration and what must be done by the city.
Well, essentially our argument is that it benefits the current and aspiring native-born middle class to have a progressive immigration policy. And that the existing conversation was pretty inadequate. And we don't have to deal with some of these conversations in New York of, as we do around the country of either, round them up and send them home, or let's keep as many here as possible, but let's make sure that we can exploit as many as possible. That's your kind of Chamber of Commerce, view. Our take was there's a shared economic interest here. And in many ways, New York City is the perfect laboratory for this because it's immigrant communities who have revived, resuscitated dying neighborhoods. It's the immigrants who will fuel New York City's middle class. So, or the existence, the perpetuation of New York City's middle class, if there's going to be one. So, our take, which is really much more applicable to a national conversation, is that we've got to come up with a policy that is actually also in the best interest of the current and aspiring middle class. That you can't just do good immigration reform because it's the right thing to do. It's also got to make sense for American workers.
What are some elements of this policy?
Well, we
agenda?
have, basically we come up with two requirements for any policy. One is it needs to recognize the critical role that immigrants, documented and undocumented, play in the economy. Nowhere more true than in New York City. And two, it's got to strengthen the hand of immigrants in the workplace. And that's part of what John was talking about in terms of easy exploitation. work sites. I mean, there isn't a week that goes by where there isn't some accident where an undocumented immigrant is killed because they have no hand. And even the question of whether or not they have legal recourse is debated. So, and that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help native workers, native-born workers, to be in a workplace where one group can be easily exploited. I mean, if you were an employer, who would you pick? So, but the thing about New York, and this is why you have a mayor who very rarely takes to the pages, for example, of the Wall Street Journal, editorial page, but will do so to talk about why we need a comprehensive immigration reform package, because New York City is the laboratory. I mean, this is the perfect example of why immigrants play a critical role in the country. But there are things we have to do. Otherwise, we will have a situation that pits.
We have to provide, don't we? One of the major things is language.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is
such a shortcoming right now.
We've been praising the mayor a lot,
Yeah.
but I'll say that it took a long time for the mayor, who recognizes the value of speaking many languages. I mean, his campaign websites were on at least 17 or 18 languages, but it took a long time for grassroots advocates to push for the Department of Education to require that their materials be translated into languages other than English, because all this talk about parental involvement and Herman Badillo and his whole shtick, and I mean, there are. But how can parents who
welfare offices, anything,
right? Well,
health.
Exactly. I mean, how can parents be involved in the education of their children? If the materials aren't presented to them in a language they understand at a time when they are trying to learn English, when we have ESL classes filled to capacity. So and this maybe is too small bore for Ronnie, but there are public policy interventions that we can make to facilitate.
It's not at all. I mean, this English as a second language is very important,
Right.
and we don't provide enough opportunities for people to take the classes or anything, and we don't provide people with translators when they need them. I mean,
and how the kids are doing in school is critical too, and it's maybe an underemphasized part of school reform, but it's a huge challenge.
Right.
I mean, CUNY itself, half of the students in CUNY are foreign-born, and if you consider also the children of immigrants, it's 3/4 of CUNY
that's
students.
that's
So
your
it's
classes too.
CUNY is an absolutely vital engine of creating a new immigrant
incredible.
middle class in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, the education system from K through what we're doing here is absolutely vital. What else can we do? John, you mentioned earlier or in a previous show, Ronnie, on Ronnie's segment, I mean, I'm losing my mind, the importance of labor market activities and reforms. What needs to be done in terms of labor market?
Well, I think there needs to be we don't really have a comprehensive system for matching people with jobs in New York City. We have thousands of individual programs. I think the administration, through the Center for Economic Opportunity, is trying to bring more coherence to that. But if you think about it, there are kids who are not making satisfactory progress in school, who are prone to drop out, and who are going to have a hard time finding a job. Or there are kids who've gotten in trouble and gone off to jail and are coming out and having a hard time finding a job. From the most difficult to employ up through, college graduates, I think, basically can pretty much find jobs for themselves. But short of that, I think we need to think about how to systematically match people with employment opportunities.
Have we improved the rate of watching the success rate? I mean, has it extended beyond whatever it was, 60 days, 90 days, whether a person still has the job, or do we still have the other kind of system?
The mayor's anti-poverty initiative is a significant piece of it is looking at upgrading the retention strategies and enriching career ladder development and so forth. So it's definitely on the policy radar screen.
Is I'm sorry, go on, because I don't want to take the time, but is our community college system adequate enough?
Well, we have a great community college
we do.
system. It's very extensive. They're doing exciting things. Is our graduation rate what we want it to be? Are all the parts of the system performing, at tip-top shape? I'm not sure we can say that, but
is it able to absorb all the people who want to go or should go?
Well, it absorbs a huge number of people, it's a critical
very important
stepping stone for people who are not going to get a four-year college degree to find a way into a decent job here. And on the whole, I think it's CUNY community colleges are doing a good job.
Just a side note that in our survey of those 100 leaders on the future of New York City's middle class, there was support for eliminating tuition at CUNY, which is, of course. But there are other, for example, the council passed a bill, and I'm not sure if the veto was overridden, to enable women on welfare to be able to count higher education as work credit.
Right.
We know that higher education is the single most effective way for women to permanently move out of poverty. There are small things that you can do. For example, tremendous correlation between exposure and access to early childhood education. Well, we just had a debate last year about expanding the pre-K that was available to full-day programs, and I believe we have 36,000 students, 4-year-olds, who are eligible, only funding for 2,000 seats provided. So, when we talk about how do we retain the middle class in this city, there are things that we can do, and that's not only an educational policy, but that's also a work policy.
Absolutely.
Because who the heck's going to drop off their kid and then come back?
Right.
So there are things that we can be doing.
It's such an essential policy, because we know from experience that kids who have that kind of beginning are going to do better in school. But where does that money come from? That's the question. That's why I don't know if we're able to do this all by ourselves. We're back to the housing thing again. It's years that we've talked about expanding childcare, early childcare, or things like that. Can I just ask another question? My understanding, people are living longer, and that New York City had a large population of older people, right?
Right.
But a lot of them are living on fixed incomes. So what happens to those people? Do they stay? Are they mostly middle class, and do they stay middle class? What happens as rents go up, prices go up, and everything else? Where are they in this whole thing?
Well, I'd say they're at risk. Many probably are middle class. Many are people with relatively fixed incomes. They also tend to have relatively fixed costs, at least in the sense of rent. They're the most likely to be homeowners or be in a rent-protected place and so on. But they're subject to the same forces as everybody else, and I think it's definitely something to worry about.
What other policy proposals are out there? Well, you have DMI as a middle class test. What is this middle class test?
When you say DMI, I think you should repeat.
Drum Major Institute.
Well, the middle class, the test was really about our immigration policy, but the survey, we tried to put together, instead of recreating the wheel on this stuff, we tried to take these, 100 New Yorkers who between them have, countless hours and experience and wisdom, and we came up, there was consensus around a few things: making the income tax structure more progressive, expanding universal pre-K so that it's full day, expanding income eligibility for state-subsidized health insurance programs.
Which we haven't touched on here, but go ahead.
Requiring large businesses to provide health insurance to their employees or contribute to a fund. There are things that that there's already consensus for. So now the question is, moving forward to the next cycle, will people take these ideas? Because, we have kind of consensus, and that's what we tried to build here, and that's what part of our forum was about.
Is the political will there? Is the political desire there? Are there the candidates and who are the spokespeople for the middle class? Who are the emerging or established political leaders that can articulate
or spokespeople for sensible policies, enlightened new policies?
I think every potential political leader of the city wants to think of themselves as a spokesperson for the middle class.
Absolutely. But do they know what
so
they
then
mean?
The question is, how are they articulating that? What are they grabbing onto? And different ones have different ways of coming at it.
And who's facilitating the conversation? So one of the questions that we asked people was, to what extent is the press doing a good job of reporting what the policy implications are for the middle class in the city? And overwhelmingly, the view was negative. We certainly got a lot of coverage for our survey and for our event, so hopefully that's a start. But otherwise, there is a lack of connection between these debates and how they actually impact the quality of people's lives. And so, that facilitating those kinds of conversations is key.
But the press is so inadequate to begin with, and it gets more and more inadequate because of what's going on. Yeah. There's something happening in our world.
Well, I think it's
a political horse race kind of thing.
But it's a world of political horse race. We did a survey actually analyzing the reporting press, and it's the same experts that they go to
Always.
That would probably
Like Doug
free up a
Muzzio.
lot of
Thank
the,
you.
and John Mollenkopf, that would probably free up a lot of their time.
But it's the lack
but
of
it's the
coverage.
same, but it's a lack of coverage. But it's also
I
the
do
same kinds
refer
of people.
people to you.
I know. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that that the press, that there is a somewhat inadequate conversation that connects the politics.
This is just total inadequate. You're being so generous. You see, you're both so polite and so generous. The press is totally inadequate. They don't cover that kind of local news. It's either the sensational news in the Post and the News, or it's some broad amorphous thing in the Times. I mean,
or just
they're
politics
not
or
doing local
policy in
stuff.
the context of politics.
Right.
And if you just do policy in the context of politics, then you just have the horse race conversation, and then you don't locate the policies that are being discussed. And I feel like John's going to disagree with me in the broader context of how they actually impact people.
Go ahead, John.
I think actually the Times does an amazingly good job, and I spend a couple of hours every day with it. And when you think about the series on class in America and so forth, they
Sure.
do get into things that
That's
are not just of the moment or just of the particular political horse race. Any news medium has got to reflect its audience and
Right.
develop its audience, and so they're going to cover partly who's reading the paper and what those people are interested in, which may not be what's going on in Richmond Hill.
Right.
But people
exactly.
aren't reading the papers.
But
That's the other
also-
problem.
but
The
also I
circulation
think-
is way
Well,
down.
but I also think though that it's up to those who have access to the press
Absolutely.
to respond, to use it responsibly. And so, but I think in terms of your question about the spokespeople, part of the point of this is not to say we need a whole, we need to take the middle class away. And we need to isolate them and have a specific policy agenda for them and specific spokespeople and advocacy
Right.
groups.
We're
And
not
let's start
saying
raising
that.
money. We're not saying
Right.
that.
Right.
The point is, how do we take the communities that have been agitating for these kinds of change, but who are relatively for more investment in education, for more access to healthcare, but who are relatively powerless, which is one of the reasons we need a middle class. Is that's where. So how do you take those issues and demonstrate that those challenges go higher and higher up the income spectrum in this town, and that a middle class agenda is the same thing as an agenda for the poor, and that but that a poverty agenda isn't enough because you're not going to be poor or not poor. You have to be poor, and then you have to think about when you're not poor, what does that mean, and can you live in this city if you're a working class person? So just alleviating entrenched poverty is actually only half of the solution. So this is not about creating some new movement. This is about really taking what exists now and the questions that we already know and demonstrating to those who need to make decisions that in fact this is their issue too. This is their constituents' issues too.
Yeah.
Well, and I think
Go ahead, John.
I think intellectuals and public thinkers and academics and so forth have a responsibility to take a step back and ask what are the forces that are driving us
Yep.
in the wrong direction. To what extent can public policy address those forces? Which kinds of public policy? And then how do we gather this consensus around
Is that
doing something
conversation
about it?
taking place in the political arena? I understand that it's beginning. I mean, clearly the aftermath of that conference sort of suggested that. Is that
Aftermath.
happening?
It
Makes it sound like
no,
people.
no, right.
The short answer is no. There have been a number of op-ed pieces about
Right.
how the parties are, brain dead. They're not talking
In a
about
column,
ideas.
yeah, a column here, there,
but
nothing.
below the surface, there are political clubs, neighborhood organizations, various kinds of forums
Labor
of people where these debates do go on, and.
So there's ferment
There is
underneath.
definitely
Well,
ferment.
absolutely, and that's
Always
part of
happened.
what.
But, now, wait a minute. I mean, those debates have gone on forever.
But I think the question is, do you, for example, when Anthony Weiner ran for mayor in 2005 and Freddie Ferrer was in that primary, and they talked about a middle class agenda, but it wasn't viewed substantively, it was viewed as a strategic question.
Right.
That will not
Sort of
take
the
place.
two cities phenomenon
Right, that will not take
argument.
place in 2009. People will have an expectation that if you really want to speak for the middle class, that you need to have a policy agenda that supports it. And I think I do think that there is a higher interest and level of engagement and understanding that we're at a critical moment in determining what's happening in this city.
So
And,
go ahead.
Well, I just think we change the baseline.
Well,
That's what you have to do. You change the baseline so that it's not the Manhattan Institute whispering in the ear, and this is a little plug, but so it's not the Manhattan Institute with a pro-corp. And I debated them after the conference about,
Right.
well, you have to keep this environment competitive, and you have to make sure that, but not answering any of the key infrastructure questions. So you have to change who's talking and who's
then
whispering in the
what's so
ear of
interesting
people
is
who
the
are, and that's why we did our
irony.
conference.
Is the irony that you have as a presidential candidate, Rudy Giuliani, who certainly didn't address any of these issues when he was there, talking and running as the mayor of New York City and all the wonderful jobs he's done. I've always found the interconnection between politics and public policy people to be, I love public policy, I love issues, but it's a very depressing. Do we call it a nexus? No, an intersection. We're laughing because there are very few far-sighted political people. They are interested in what's going to help them get elected or the next time, either first time or the next
you're
time.
You're really a cynic.
I am. I've become very cynical. Listen, I'm a survivor of 12 years in the city council and more years working in the state and city government. So I'm very aware of it.
Thing about Plan 2030. I mean, that was, I was sitting in the audience, the mayor was giving a speech, I got kind of goosebumps of feeling like, oh, this is why I do this work again. It's to actually be able to...
When you get people elected to the city council with 2,000 votes, what are we talking about? That there's an energized electorate? There isn't. How do we energize it? I think we have to have a different kind of politics. I think nationally that you see it with Obama, that he's touching people a little differently.
But you're saying it needs to be
saying
more
he's
locally...
representing fundamental change. I don't know about that yet. But it's that kind of an excitement and a mission, I think, that we need here. We can't do it without it.
Okay, 30 seconds each. What do we need? What do we need?
About fixing the middle class?
Yep.
We need better jobs for New Yorkers.
That was like 10 seconds. Now I got to... We need to stop
these. 50.
We need to stop these outdated conversations, measuring the city based just on a question of taxes, and realize that New Yorkers are ahead of politicians on this. What they want is an infrastructure, education, health care, quality of their neighborhoods that's going to enable them to live well in this city, and that's really where we need to be focusing our attention.
Excellent. That concludes the two-part conversation on the middle class. It's been, as always, a pleasure. The pleasure with you, John, Andrea, and you, Ronnie. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.